Well, morning. It's great to be back with you. So Robin, my wife, gives me advice every time I stand up and speak. And this morning her advice to me was make sure your fly's done up by the time you get back down after the baptism, which I thought was excellent advice, to be honest. She is my best friend, and that's the sort of advice that best friends give to you. I have another really special friend who attends Gracecity, and you'll understand why I'm not going to call him by his real name. I'm going to call him Ken, because he's quite shy, and there's a couple of parts of his story I'd like to share with you, one now and one at the end of my message. But I first met Ken when he came along to a course similar to Alpha that we were running, explaining to people the reality of Jesus and things. And the thing I remember about that course was a one-word question that Ken dropped in at the start. Because what we do, we have icebreaker questions to get people meeting each other, get them talking together, just get them a bit of confidence. And one of the common questions that we ask at the start of the course is, if you were certain, if you knew for certain that God was real, and you could ask God one question, what would that one question be? And Ken says, I've got a question. And he sort of leans forward in his seat, and he has had a hard life, and he has this weathered face, really serious, and he has this gravelly smoker's voice. And everyone leans forward, and his question is, why? That's it, one word. And what was so fascinating is that I sort of glanced up, I'm looking around the room to see if people were confused, but they weren't confused. They're all nodding like they understood exactly what he's asking. And so I said, Ken, flesh that out. What do you mean? He says, why is there so much pain in the world? Why is there evil in this world? Why is there so much suffering? And Ken has really good reason to ask that question. Ken comes from a home where he should have been loved, and he was abused in his own home, to the extent that he was taken out of that home and put into state care where he was meant to be kept safe. But in state care, he was abused. And so he learned to defend himself, and he went from this gentle, caring, quiet young boy into a young man who was familiar with violence, and that became his life. And right into his elderly years now, the physical and mental scars of the pain that he endured as a child have stuck with him. He has plenty of reason to ask what one scholar calls the awesome why. Not awesome as in cool, but awesome as in just formidable and daunting, the awesome, fearful why. And as we wrap up our Ask Anything series today, that's the question that we want to be addressing. If there is really a good God, why is there so much pain in the world? And we've framed the question around pain, but it's kind of wider than that. Some scholars, when they talk about this issue, they call it the problem of evil, because when what they mean by evil is not just moral evil like murder and torture and things. It encompasses pretty much anything bad. It includes natural evil, things like earthquakes and cancer that also hurt us. But the reality is, this is a reality for all of us. It doesn't matter where you're from, what language you speak. It doesn't matter what your faith is, your religion. It doesn't matter whether you have none. It doesn't matter whether you change your faith and say, I just don't believe. Pain will follow you no matter where you go or no matter what you believe. And so that's the question for us today. We want to answer the awesome why question. And as I do that, my message today is going to be in two sort of distinct halves. And I am going to come to the more pastoral and hopefully practical part towards the end. And if you are genuinely hurting right now, please hold on for that, because I'm going to start with a bit more of an academic discussion. And the reason I want to do that is I think it's so important to address the argument that's sometimes put forward that because there is so much pain, there can't possibly be the type of God that Christians believe in. And the problem with that is that I think if people stop believing in God, if God is taken out of the equation, I think the most beautiful solution to the problem is taken out of the equation. So I think it's vital that we address that. So that's kind of the two parts of the message as to where I'm heading. So how then do Christians deal with this problem of an all-good, all-loving God, but there being evil in the world? And we feel it, don't we? We see evil going on. And so down through the centuries, great minds have tried to reconcile. How does this go together? And probably one of the first thinkers to kind of summarize this was a gentleman by the name of Epicurus. He was a Greek philosopher who lived about 300 years before Jesus. And the summation or the argument that comes out of his summation goes like this. And you may have heard this before. He says, if there's an all-good God, surely he would want a world with no evil. And if he's all-powerful, that God, he could make a world with no evil. But evil exists, so how can there be an all-good, all-powerful God? And it seems like a strong argument, not just because it seems logical, but because we feel it. We feel the gravitas of this argument. We see evil in the world. We see dictators killing their own people. We see earthquakes and famines and disasters. We get sick and we get stolen from. We feel moral outrage at things that go on. We see the evil in the world and we feel its pain. And so this argument is put forward not just quietly, but often passionately and loudly. Look at what is going on. How can you dare say to us that there is a good God if he allows this? And so what may fascinate you is that a hidden flaw in this very argument is what has brought some of the great minds of history, brought them away from atheism, away from disbelief in God, and towards God and an acceptance of his reality. And one of the most famous people, thinkers like that, is a man by the name of C.S. Lewis, who some of you may be familiar with. He wrote the Narnia series. He wrote several books defending the reality of Christianity. He was an Oxford professor, highly educated. But before he wrote the books defending Christianity, he had been an atheist, arguing forcefully against Christianity, against the idea of there being a God. But as he did that, often based on the problem of pain and injustice, he started to realize that there was a self-defeating flaw in the very reasoning he was putting forward. And he sums that up like this in his book, Mere Christianity. This is what he says. He says, "My argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man doesn't call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? I could have given up my idea of justice by saying it was nothing but a private idea of my own. But if I did that, then my argument against God collapsed too. For the argument depended on saying that the world was really unjust, not simply that it didn't happen to please my private fancies." He concludes, thus, in the very act of trying to prove that God did not exist, atheism turns out to be too simple. So the problem he recognizes that to be able to look around, and when he sees things that he doesn't like, he needs to say that they are definitively, they are objectively unjust. Not just that he doesn't happen to like them. So as a comparison, think about a small child goes into a toy store with mum, sees something shiny that he loves the look of, and he grabs it, goes to walk out the door, and mum says, "You can't do that." And he throws a tantrum. He says, "That's not fair." But he's wrong, isn't he? Because it's going against his personal likes and dislikes. There is a law over him that says you can't just take shiny toys out of the stores. And that's exactly what C.S. Lewis is recognizing. He's saying when we look around the world, it's not enough for us just to say it's unfair, I don't like it, because we could be wrong. We could be toddlers in the store. He says to definitively say, to objectively say that the world really is evil, not just the law of the jungle happening. He says we have to have a transcendent, a law above us, a law that is universally binding. But he says, when I look for a transcendent moral law over us, where would I get that apart from a transcendent moral lawgiver? And what he recognized is that to have a definitive and objective morality over us, he starts depending on the very type of being that he's trying to disprove. And so he says his atheism, the argument for his atheism collapses. And I imagine some of you are thinking, well, I can see where he's coming from, but there are still atheists today. And I imagine they have read Mere Christianity. So how do they get around what C.S. Lewis is pointing out? And I clearly don't have time to look at every permutation, but can I give you the two main explanations of this? The first one is to say, well, we can have morals, we can have this morality, but we don't need God for it. So the argument would be that we have evolved certain morals as we've gone on, that the wiring of our DNA has so turned out that when we are compassionate and when we are generous, that promotes human flourishing. Or we have social contracts that we've agreed in our cultures that promote human flourishing. And that's often the words that you'll hear described. But there's a bit of a problem with that if we're looking for that objective standard, because how can human flourishing be anything but subjective? Surely that is just us saying human flourishing is how we decide what's right and wrong because we're human. What about mosquito flourishing? All of the murders of the mosquitoes around the world. I mean, it has to be subjective, surely, just because we're human. And what happens when, as humans, we disagree? Do we want Hitler's version of human flourishing, or would we prefer Mother Teresa's version of human flourishing? And this is why we then start appealing to this standard, this transcendent standard over us. But again, that starts to point to a transcendent moral lawgiver. And for that reason, another explanation is to say, well, we don't like the idea of a moral lawgiver, so we'll depart with morals. And you see some of the best-known atheists in history saying this. Some of you may be familiar with the French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre. And he says this, he says, the existentialist, atheist, finds it extremely embarrassing that God does not exist, for there disappears with him all possibility of finding values in an intelligible heaven. There can no longer be a good a priori, just by logical assumption, since there is no infinite and perfect consciousness to think of it. He says everything, any moral, just everything is indeed permitted if God does not exist. In a similar way, the British atheist, but later than Sartre, Richard Dawkins says, in a universe of blind physical forces and genetic replication, so a universe without God, some people are going to get hurt and other people are going to get lucky. And you won't find any rhyme or reason to it, nor any justice. The universe, he says, that we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at the bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good. And that might make sense if we really are in a universe with no transcendent standards. But the issue is that even though people who put these sort of arguments forward, even though Richard Dawkins may deny this, he doesn't live like that. And he doesn't even write like that. He's not consistent in this. So that quote is out of his book, River Out of Eden. And he says there is no justice. But then he writes another book, The God Delusion, where he rants at God for being unjust. How do you have that both ways? You simply can't. And so again, he stumbles over the very problem that C.S. Lewis identified, the very problem that helps C.S. Lewis understand there must be a God, because we recognise this transcendent moral law over us. So I think far from the problem of pain, the problem of injustice, the problem of evil, disproving God, the fact that we recognise the problem in fact, points to the reality of God. It supports the reality of this being who has set these standards over us that we all recognize, no matter where we're from. Every culture recognizes compassion and kindness as good. Every culture recognizes the torture of the innocent and rape as a bad thing. Even if it would further the human species, we recognize it as morally bad. And so it points to the reality of God. So that's a kind of an academic argument dealing with that accusation, but I think all that really does is brings us back to our starting question, doesn't it? If there is this all-good God, this transcendent being who is good in his nature, why then is there so much pain in the world? Where did it come from? And the very short biblical answer to this is to say, well, when God first made the world, it wasn't the mess that it is today. When we pick up the Bible in the very first chapter, we see God creating the heavens and the earth. And we get to the first chapter when he's done his creation, and what we read is this: God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. So God didn't create evil to start with. He made it, and he stands back and he says it's very good. But one of the good things that was included in the creation that he made is that he gave humans, as people made in his image, this beautiful thing called free will. And no one complains about free will. I don't know how many of you have ever protested, walked down Queen Street. Anyone here protested against free will? Carried a placard down Queen Street, down with free will, back to bondage. I want to do everything my mum tells me every day. No one protests against freedom. We love free will. It is a beautiful thing, but it is also a highly risky thing. Because if we give genuine free will, we give the ability for unforced love, and that's amazing. But if it's genuinely free, we also give the freedom for our love to be rejected. If we give genuine free will, we give the opportunity to show kindness. But if it's really free will, it gives the opportunity for cruelty as well. And unfortunately, that's what we see as we keep reading after God had created. We get 2 chapters on, and the good gift of free will that God had lavished on the first people was used to rebel, and they disobey. And what seemed like a small sin creates a crack in a dam that leads to hatred and eventually to murder and to all of the moral evil and cruelty that we see in the world today. And not just moral evil, because we see natural evil coming in at the same time. God says to them, this is going to change the order of creation. There are going to be thorns because of what you've done. The physical creation will change because you didn't stick to the order that I put in place. The created order is going to change too. So that's the short version, the short kind of biblical version of how pain came to be in the world. But again, I don't think that's the question we're asking when we ask, why is there so much pain? I don't think people who ask that are generally after a theological, biblical treatise on original sin. I think what we're asking is why am I burying my own child? Why has my business been taken from me unjustly? Why did someone I love betray me in such a painful way? Why am I the one who gets the diagnosis that I've just received? And I don't think those are just the hardest questions for a pastor to have to face. I think those awesome why questions are the hardest ones any of us have to face. And we do have to face that from time to time. So can I encourage you, when you are in that situation and someone you care for has trusted you enough to voice an awesome why like that, don't feel obliged to have to come up with all of the answers. I think the best answer when the wounds are still raw, when they are in the middle of their pain, is to admit, sometimes we just don't know. But we love you and we want to walk with you through this. Ask what practical care you can show them. offer to pray for them. And when you do that, don't kind of sneak in a small sermon into your prayer, because so often we just don't know the answers at that time. The beautiful thing, though, is that I think over time we do start to see answers to the awesome why question. Because as we go on through life, we collect stories, and I think we get to see beauty that God can bring out of pain. One of the things I tell people is that the silver lining of gaining a silver lining is that through the years you collect stories of God doing the incredible, God doing the impossible, when he takes situations that are so painful, seem so bleak, so dark, but he orchestrates and he brings out of them such beauty and so many good things. And I think that starts to change our thinking. I think it's important that we understand that. So what might be some of the ways that God can bring beauty and good out of the pain that we face? Can I just share a few of them with you? The first one is, I think pain has an amazing way of getting our attention, turning our eyes back to him as our perfect Father when we have turned our back on him or when we are deaf to him. So C.S. Lewis, again, puts it beautifully. He says a famous phrase some of you may have heard. He said that God whispers to us in our pleasures. He speaks to us in our conscience, but he shouts to us in our pain. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. And I know this very personally, because one of the darkest times of my life was growing up and as a teenager in an atheist family. We never went to church. Mum and Dad bought an orchard, and in the space of 5 years lost everything they had ever worked for. We sold half of it to try and pay off some debt, to try and survive. The half we sold included the house. We shifted into the packing shed. It's so cold the water in the toilet froze. When you see as a teenager your mum and dad crying on a regular basis, that's a dark time. But God used exactly that time to literally open up our doors so that a little country church could come in and care for us and display what God looked like and present some of the best evidence for him in just the way they loved us and ultimately introduced us to him. I'm a pastor today. My brother has been a pastor. My sister leads Alpha courses because of the way God used that little country church in the middle of our pain. Sometimes God uses pain in beautiful ways like that. I think secondly and similarly, God uses our pain to let others see him working. I imagine some of you, like me, have seen some of the best evidence for the reality of God in the way that he carries some of his people through such hard times with so much dignity. And as they just exhibit faith in him, they just have this grace and this beauty, and he just carries them. And in a similar way, it opens up the door for us to show love in those situations. For God's people to wrap his arms around others. It's like Paul says when he wrote to the church in Corinth. He says, God comforts us in all our troubles so that we can comfort those in trouble with the comfort we ourselves receive. So God can do that. He can use opportunities so that others get to see him and his people working. Thirdly, I think God uses pain to shape our character far more than pleasure ever does. I imagine if you look around you in your circle of friends, if you look around the church, the people who you admire the most for their humility, for their compassion, for their genuine care, their empathy towards others, I would be willing to bet money that they are people who have been through pain themselves. Because pain shapes our character far more than pleasure ever does. And I think as the perfect Father, God is far more interested in our character than he is in our comfort. And so he can bring beauty out of even painful situations. I think fourthly as well, pain reminds us of home, and that our true home is not here. Our true home is with him. And I've seen this probably more in the last 18 months in the lives of some special friends of ours. After they lost their 25-year-old daughter when, after leaving a wedding, a drunk driver crossed the middle lane and hit her in a head-on. And our friends are pastors, so I think if you looked at them, you would say that they are keen Christians, but they have never spoken as much about eternity and heaven and God and going to be with him as what they've done in the last 18 months. And I think pain has an amazing way of causing us to lift our eyes, remind us that this world is not our home, and it's definitely not the way it's meant to be. Our home is with our perfect Father. So I think when we see those as just some of the ways that God might allow some of the pain that goes on in our lives, we start to understand that there can actually be good reason for God allowing pain in the world, even painful pain. And I think that's so important, because I think when we see that, the question in our head starts to shift from why does God allow this to perhaps how should I be thinking about this? How can I handle this? The beauty of understanding why God might have allowed past pain is that it helps us face future pain. And I think that's crucial, because the most important thing that goes on in our lives is not the pain, it's not the waves that come our way, it's not the disasters, it's not the sickness, it's not the loss. It is how we think about those things and how we face those things. And that you will have seen that in people's lives. You will have seen some people who face incredible pain and they do it with dignity and grace. And you will see other people who face what seem like quite minor difficulties and they just seem to melt in the face of those. And I'm not saying this to make anyone feel guilty that they haven't handled small difficulties well, because I don't think any of us do. I don't always do that well myself. What I'm saying is that the people who handle pain well have probably faced it in the past and they have learned to handle it well. And surely that's a good thing, because we want to learn to handle pain well. It is a reality. And so if we can handle it well, surely don't we want to learn to do that? So I want to give you 4 ways I think that can help our thinking for when the next awesome why comes along. And the first one is to recognize that pain is just a reality in a fallen world. Pain is a reality. And if you have a misguided belief that pain, particularly when you become a Christian, will disappear, perhaps that by becoming a Christian and trusting yourself to Jesus, you will always be wealthy, you'll be healthy, you will be popular, you will be blindsided when you find out that's not true. So we have to recognize, don't we, that pain is just a reality in a fallen world. And even though there is an all-good, all-powerful God, he sometimes allows a lot of pain for good reasons. But we have to recognize it is a reality. Second thing that helps our thinking is that he can actually use that pain for good. So when we think back of some of the examples of how he does that, think about perhaps a toddler gets taken by its loving mother to go and visit the doctor. And the mother has told the toddler that the doctor is a really nice guy. They're going to see him because doctors help us. And then the next thing, the doctor stabs a needle into the toddler's arm. And that wasn't what the toddler was expecting. What it doesn't understand is that the needle is going to protect it from measles or another disease, something terrible. And so the pain is for a good purpose. But the toddler doesn't understand that. Fast forward a few years, the toddler is now a teenager out skateboarding or skiing or whatever and breaks his ankle in 14 places, is in excruciating pain. He probably can't wait for that painful little thing wherever you inject a needle to stop the pain in his ankle, because he understands that the doctor can use that little bit of pain for his good. How much more can the creator of the universe, the greatest healer, surgeon of them all, use pain for our good? And when we start to see pain like that, when we recognize that God has this incredible ability to use pain for our good, it helps us see it in a very different way, helps us understand that even when we don't know what's going on, we can still trust him. And the way I like to see it is that we can see our pain in perspective. And there's a biblical story that I always love that helps us, that I think illustrates this. It's a story of Joseph that we find in Genesis. And I don't know if you're familiar with the story of Joseph. You may have heard of Joseph and the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, the musical based on his life. If you're not familiar, Joseph was the favourite son of his father. And because of that, his brothers are jealous of him. And as brothers do, they decide to kill him, because that's what brothers do. Then they decide, well, actually, better than killing Joseph, we could make some money out of this, and let's just sell him to slave traders. So that's what they do. And Joseph is shipped off to Egypt, where he works faithfully for his Egyptian master. But he is rewarded for his faithfulness by the Egyptian master's wife falsely accusing him of trying to take advantage of her. He's thrown unjustly into prison. Years down the track, he's promised that he will be released because of something he had done. That doesn't come about. He languishes in prison for years. Later on, by this amazing twist of circumstances, he goes from prisoner to being the second most powerful man in all of Egypt. Given the ability to rule and to lead Egypt and the surrounding region through a terrible famine, and people come looking to him, bowing down before him, including his brothers who had sold him into slavery. They don't recognize who he is, but he now has the power of life and death over them. And he doesn't choose to kill them. He shows grace. And the beautiful words that he says, his words are, what you intended for evil, God intended. God used for good. It's an incredible story of suffering and redemption. But the thing that stands out to me in this story, you see, he got into his powerful position in the end because God had revealed to him what was going to happen with the famine. We have no indication that earlier in his life, God had been revealing other things to him, like what would happen at the end of his life. So when his brothers sell him into slavery, he has no idea of the position that he will one day hold. When he's languishing in prison, he has no idea of the amazing position that he will one day stand in. And I think to myself, what would it have been like if God had have revealed the end of his story to him when he is being sold into slavery, or when he is languishing unjustly in prison? And he could have just sort of mentally stepped back and said, oh, this is the bit of my story where my brothers sell me into slavery. Can you believe that? I'm glad it's not the end of the story. Or, oh, this is the bit where I'm stuck in prison. But I know it's not the end of my story, because he knows the end. And I don't think it would have taken the pain away. But how much would that have set his difficulties, his pain, his suffering in perspective? And what stands out for me is that if we belong to Jesus, we are completely accepted by God, and we know the end of our story. And our story makes the end of his story look small. The Bible, when it talks about where we're going, the way our story finishes, it says, no eye has seen, no ear has heard how amazing the end of our story is. And so it lets us see our story in incredible perspective. But I think even more than that, it's not just that God is waiting for us when we enter heaven. I think God is wanting to enter into our story now as well. And so pain can be a call back to him, not just at the end of our lives, but right now. And I see this in another part of Ken's story. Perhaps not even Ken's story, but Ken's life partner's story. Because Ken's life partner, who he had lived with for decades, had also been abused as a child. She had suffered and she had felt that pain. And when we met her, she was different to Ken. She was an atheist. And when we're reaching out to him and he's receptive, he listens to us talking about God, she didn't want anything to do with that. That was until she was diagnosed with cancer, and she was given 4 months to live. And as an atheist at the time, she is angry about this. The question that she put to Ken is, why would your God allow this to happen to me? Which is just throwing, again, another awesome why, like a hand grenade into Ken's lap. And he's praying again, Lord, why? Why would you let this happen? I belong to you now. Why would you let her go through this? But as they went through that grieving and that wrestling together, after a while, Claire starts praying. As an atheist, she hadn't done that. She starts praying and she finds this incredible peace. And that just grows. And she finds that she's actually interested in God. And so she softens towards not just him, but towards us. And she comes along to one of the courses that we'd run, and we explained to her, Claire, God has stepped into human history so that you can have eternal life, so that the end of your cancer is not the end. He is offering you eternal life. You are created to know him and live with him forever. And a week after we finished the course, Claire took up Jesus' offer and she entrusted herself to him, and she finds this incredible peace that she had never known. A week after that, she marries Ken, who she had lived with for 48 years. And a week after that, Claire died. And she goes home to the Father who loved her more than anyone else ever had. And that's what a perfect Father does. He's more interested in our closeness to him than he is in our comfort. And if it takes pain to call us to himself, that's exactly what he will do. Because that's what a perfect Father would do. Not just an all good, not just an all powerful, but an all knowing, eternally existing Father who sees everything in perspective and calls us back to himself. So this morning, if you are facing pain, if you are asking right now the awesome why, can I just leave 2 super quick things with you? Bring your pain to God. Just pray to him. Doesn't need to be anything polished. Ken's prayer was 1 word. But bring your pain to him, because that's exactly what he wants. He is the perfect Father. And if you're not a Christian, if you haven't yet entrusted yourself to Jesus, and you don't yet see God as your Father, please talk to someone here about what it means to do that, because that is the best news you will ever hear. Secondly, if you're here this morning and you're hurting and no one else in the room knows, can I please encourage you, tell someone here that you trust. Because as the perfect Father, he leads the perfect family. That's what the church is. For all of our imperfections, when we function well as a church, we are his family that wraps around other individuals in their little families. That is the nature of God. And so I think when we look at this, when we recognize the problem of pain, I think far from disproving him, I think the reality of pain points us to God's reality. But as well as that, I think when we look at the pain of reality, it calls us to him, calls us back to his care. We don't have to face pain alone. It is real, but it's not final. And we have a Father who wants to carry us through it. Can I pray for you? If you are going through pain, if you are walking next to someone who is, I would love to lift you up to God, that he would help you to be able to do that. Can we pray together? Almighty Father, we love belonging to you, and we love being able to come to you in this real broken world that we live in, this world that won't always be like this world that you will restore, but until that day, we want to put ourselves in your gracious, compassionate hands. Father, for those of us in this room who are hurting this morning, please open our eyes to you. Help us to bring our hurts and our pain to you.
I pray for the people in that situation. Would you flood them with your peace that goes beyond what any of us can understand? Help them to share that with us, and help us to respond to those around us who are hurting in the same way as you respond to us. Help us to reflect you well, to practically care, to empathetically love, to listen well, and to show them what your heart for them is like. So we want to put ourselves in your hands. We are so grateful that we can do this. Thank you, Almighty Father. Amen. So before we finish, we're now going to take communion together. And I think communion just gives us such a reminder of the cross. And that just fits so well with what we've talked about this morning, because I can't think of a better example of God taking something so painful and definitively unjust and bringing more beauty out of that than any other moment in history. And so before we come up and take the cup, can I ask you just to reflect, just to try and imagine that you are one of Jesus' disciples, looking up at him as he's hanging there on the cross. One of your own betrayed him last night. You ran away and abandoned him last night, and you are looking up at him, and you have become convinced that he was the Messiah King who would rule the world, and yet here he is dying as a criminal. You've seen with his own eyes how he calmed storms and gave sight to the blind. He raised people from the dead, and yet you're looking up at him and you can hear him gasping for breath, groaning in agony. And what must have seemed like the lowest point in human history, literally darkness falls. The enemy, evil, must have been rejoicing, and yet it is right in that time, right in that hour, that he is winning the greatest victory humanity history would ever see. Just as the prophet Isaiah said, by his wounds, right then we are being healed. By his separation, right then we are being accepted. By the greatest injustice in human history, he is buying our justification. And by his death, he is right then securing our eternal life. If you ever wonder, can God redeem beauty from bad? The cross, I think, is the best example. And then by walking away from his grave a couple of days later, he showed that we will one day too. So if that is meaningful to you, if you want to celebrate that, I'd love it if you would just come up with us and take the bread and the cup and just celebrate the victory that Jesus won when he was willing to shed his blood for us.